At the turn of the 20th century, the world stood at the height of confidence. Cities glowed with electric light, factories roared with industrial progress, and a sense of unstoppable momentum swept across the globe. Nations believed they were entering an age of science, technology, and prosperity. But behind this outward optimism, political tensions and national rivalries formed an invisible web of danger, one that would eventually pull the entire world into an unprecedented catastrophe. This is the story of the world before World War I, an era defined by ambition, competition, and fragile peace. Europe at this time was the unquestioned center of global power. The British Empire ruled over nearly 1/4 of the world's population and possessed the most powerful navy ever created. Its industrial wealth and colonial reach shaped international trade and politics. Across the North Sea, the German Empire, young, energetic, and rapidly industrializing, emerged as a fierce competitor. Germany's factories outpaced most of Europe in steel production, machinery, and scientific innovation. Its navy expanded aggressively, challenging Britain's command of the oceans and setting off a naval arms race that worried leaders worldwide. To the south and east lay the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a vast, multi-ethnic state held together not by unity, but by fragile diplomacy. Dozens of ethnic groups, Slavs, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Germans, and more, lived under one imperial banner, each with its own cultural identity and political aspirations. Nationalism grew stronger every year, threatening to fracture the empire from within. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, once a dominant force across the Middle East and southeastern Europe, struggled to maintain territory and influence as internal corruption, military defeats, and economic decline reduced its power. On the far eastern edge of Europe, the Russian Empire faced turmoil of its own. Although enormous in size and rich in natural resources, Russia lagged behind Western Europe in industrial development. Its government, an autocratic monarchy, faced increasing pressure from revolutionaries, labor groups, and peasants demanding reform. A humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War had exposed Russia's weaknesses, shaking public confidence in the Tsar. This complex network of rising powers, fading empires, and ideological movements created a tense, volatile world. But the most dangerous force of all was the atmosphere of militarism. Europe's great powers believed military strength was the ultimate guarantee of national security. They poured vast sums of money into building larger armies and more advanced weapons. The introduction of the machine gun, long-range artillery, early armored vehicles, and rapid mobilization plans meant that any future conflict would be devastating on a scale never before imagined. Yet, paradoxically, many leaders believed that strong militaries would prevent war, not encourage it. But militarism alone didn't set Europe on the path to destruction. A powerful system of alliances divided the continent into competing blocs. On one side stood the Triple Entente, uniting Britain, France, and Russia in a defensive partnership. On the other side was the Triple Alliance, composed of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These alliances were meant to deter aggression, but in reality, they created a world where a conflict between two nations could escalate into a war involving all of them. Political leaders felt emboldened, believing their allies would stand beside them no matter the cost. Diplomacy grew weaker. Miscalculations became more likely, and Europe slowly transformed into a giant powder keg. Imperialism added another layer of tension. Nations competed for colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, hoping to expand their influence and gather valuable resources. These rivalries created international flashpoints, from disputes in Africa to confrontations in the Balkans. National pride surged across Europe, fueling propaganda, glorifying military service, and convincing entire populations that war could be heroic, honorable, and even necessary. For the United States, watching from across the Atlantic, Europe's tensions appeared distant but not irrelevant. The U.S. economy was booming, American industries were expanding, and many U.S. citizens believed their nation should avoid the political entanglements of Europe. Yet the United States maintained deep cultural ties to Britain, economic relationships with France, and growing diplomatic influence on the world stage. While most Americans supported neutrality, the nation was increasingly aware that events in Europe could eventually affect American trade, security, and global standing. Despite all these tensions, Europe in the early 1900s felt strangely stable. People believed the continent had evolved beyond large-scale conflict. After all, the major powers had avoided a serious continental war for nearly 50 years. New technology seemed to promise a brighter future. Railways connected cities and nations. Automobiles signaled a new era of mobility, and scientific discoveries reshaped the modern world. Many believed humanity had outgrown the violent clashes of earlier centuries. But beneath this illusion of progress and peace, the structure of global politics was dangerously brittle. The alliances were rigid. The militaries were massive. The nationalist movements were aggressive. And the political leaders underestimated just how quickly a regional crisis could spiral out of control. The world before World War I was a world living on borrowed time, one accident away from total disaster. And in the summer of 1914, that accident would come in the form of a single gunshot on a quiet street in Sarajevo. It would ignite the fuse that set Europe, and eventually the entire planet, on fire. By the summer of 1914, Europe was a continent sleepwalking toward disaster. Decades of militarism, alliances, and imperial ambition had created a tightly wound system ready to explode. All it needed was a spark, a moment so small in appearance, yet so catastrophic in consequence, that it would pull the entire world into a war unlike anything seen before. That moment came on June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, deep inside the Balkans. Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, lay within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a region simmering with ethnic tension and nationalist ambition. Many Serbs living under Austrian rule desired independence, hoping to unite with the neighboring Kingdom of Serbia. For Austria-Hungary, this dream of Serbian nationalism was more than a political threat. It was a challenge to the empire's very existence. It was here, in this contested territory, that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived for an official visit. Franz Ferdinand was not universally loved, even within his own empire. He was a reformer, someone who envisioned giving more autonomy to the many ethnic groups under Austrian rule. But for radical nationalists, especially in Serbia, his reforms represented a threat. A stable, reformed Austria-Hungary would weaken their dream of independence. And so, in the shadows, a secret Serbian nationalist group known as the Black Hand plotted to strike a blow that would echo across the world. On the morning of June 28th, the Archduke and his wife, Sophie, traveled through Sarajevo in a motorcade of open-top cars. Waiting along the route were 6 assassins, armed with pistols, bombs, and cyanide capsules. The plan was simple: kill the Archduke and ignite a political crisis. As the motorcade passed, one assassin hurled a bomb. The device bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded beneath the next one, injuring several officers. The attempt had failed, and the city fell into chaos. But fate had not finished with Franz Ferdinand. Later that morning, after deciding to visit the wounded officers at the hospital, the Archduke's driver made a critical mistake. Turning down the wrong street, he stopped the car to reverse direction, right in front of Gavrilo Princip, a young Black Hand member who had failed earlier and was now simply standing outside a cafe. In a moment that would alter the course of history, Princip stepped forward, pulled out his pistol, and fired 2 shots. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie collapsed in the car. Within minutes, both were dead. News of the assassination raced across Europe with stunning speed. For Austria-Hungary, the killing was not just an act of terrorism. It was an attack on the empire itself. Leaders in Vienna believed Serbia, whether directly or indirectly, was responsible. The empire was determined to respond with force. Yet Austria-Hungary hesitated, afraid that a war with Serbia would draw in Russia, Serbia's powerful ally. It was here that Germany stepped onto the stage. Kaiser Wilhelm II assured Austria-Hungary that Germany would back them fully, even if the crisis escalated into a war with Russia. This support became known as the blank check. With this promise, Austria-Hungary prepared a harsh ultimatum for Serbia, one designed not to be accepted, but to justify war. On July 23, 1914, Serbia received the ultimatum. It included demands so intrusive that accepting them would mean surrendering national sovereignty. Serbia, hoping to avoid war, agreed to most of the demands but rejected those that violated its constitution. Austria-Hungary considered Serbia's response inadequate. 5 days later, on July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The machinery of alliances now began to turn. Each nation pulled into the crisis like gears in a giant engine of destruction. Russia, seeing Serbia attacked, mobilized its massive army. Germany, interpreting Russian mobilization as a threat, declared war on Russia. France, bound by treaty to Russia, prepared for conflict. Germany, anticipating a two-front war, activated the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy that required striking France first by marching through neutral Belgium. On July 23, 1914, Serbia received the ultimatum. It included demands so intrusive that accepting them would mean surrendering national sovereignty. Serbia, hoping to avoid war, agreed to most of the demands but rejected those that violated its constitution. Austria-Hungary considered Serbia's response inadequate. 5 days later, on July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The machinery of alliances now began to turn. Each nation pulled into the crisis like gears in a giant engine of destruction. Russia, seeing Serbia attacked, mobilized its massive army. Germany, interpreting Russian mobilization as a threat, declared war on Russia. France, bound by treaty to Russia, prepared for conflict. Germany, anticipating a two-front war, activated the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy that required striking France first by marching through neutral Belgium. The moment Germany violated Belgian neutrality, the British government, bound by treaty and pressured by public outrage, declared war on Germany. Overnight, Europe transformed from a region of simmering tensions into a battlefield of global proportions. And across the Atlantic, Americans watched as the crisis escalated with shocking speed. The United States, led by President Woodrow Wilson, declared neutrality, determined to stay out of Europe's centuries-old rivalries. Yet Americans were captivated by the events unfolding overseas. Newspaper headlines, political speeches, and public debates revealed deep divisions in the U.S. population. Some sympathized with Britain and France out of cultural and democratic ties. Others supported Germany due to heritage, trade connections, or distrust of old European empires. The American public, though divided, agreed on one thing. No one wanted to see their country dragged into this conflict. Back in Europe, the crisis had spiraled into full-scale war. Politicians, generals, and diplomats who believed they could control events watched helplessly as mobilizations turned into declarations, and declarations turned into carnage. The July crisis, just over a month in length, had transformed a regional assassination into a global catastrophe. In 1914, almost no one imagined the scale of what was coming. Many believed the conflict would be short, decisive, and glorious. Young men across Europe rushed to enlist, convinced the war would be over by Christmas. Instead, the world was marching into a 4-year nightmare that would claim millions of lives and reshape the destiny of nations. The assassination in Sarajevo was not just the beginning of World War I. It was the moment the modern world changed forever. What followed would be the descent into trench warfare, unprecedented destruction, and the collapse of empires. And as we move to the next episode, we follow Europe from the tense political crisis of 1914 into the brutal reality of the Western Front, where the war turned into a grinding, horrifying stalemate that defined the Great War. As the summer of 1914 turned to fall, Europe plunged deeper into a conflict it could no longer control. The assassination in Sarajevo had ignited the July crisis, But the war that followed was shaped by something far larger than diplomacy or alliances. It was defined by the brutal reality of modern industrial warfare. And nowhere was this reality more devastating than on the Western Front, a line of battle that would become one of the most horrifying landscapes in human history. When Germany declared war on France, its military launched the Schlieffen Plan, a sweeping strategy aimed at delivering a quick knockout blow. German forces swept through Belgium, violating its neutrality and provoking Britain's entry into the war. As German troops advanced rapidly toward Paris, it appeared their plan might succeed. Panic spread through the French government. Refugees fled the countryside. The world watched anxiously as the fate of Western Europe hung in the balance. But in early September, at the First Battle of the Marne, the French and British armies mounted a desperate counterattack. In a dramatic and exhausting effort, one that included taxis rushing soldiers to the front lines, the Allies forced Germany to halt their advance. The Germans, unable to push further, withdrew to more defensible positions. The war of movement was over. The war of trenches had begun. As both sides dug into the earth for protection, a vast network of fortifications formed almost overnight. What began as temporary defensive shelters evolved into a complex, interconnected system of trenches, bunkers, dugouts, barbed wire fields, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. These trenches soon stretched hundreds of miles, from the North Sea all the way to the Swiss frontier. Soldiers on both sides realized they were trapped in a landscape designed not for victory, but for survival. Life in the trenches was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Soldiers faced relentless bombardments, sniper fire, and the constant threat of attack. The trenches themselves became symbols of misery, filled with mud, standing water, rats, lice, and disease. In winter, frostbite claimed limbs. In spring, the mud swallowed equipment, horses, and sometimes men. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to wet conditions, rotted soldiers' feet. The smell of death, of decaying bodies caught in no man's land, hung in the air like a permanent fog. Between the opposing trenches lay the most dangerous space on the battlefield, no man's land. A wasteland of shattered trees, craters, and tangled wire. It could vary from a few dozen yards to half a mile wide. Crossing it during an assault meant running into machine gun fire, artillery shells, snipers, and mud thick enough to trap a man. The first step on a no man's land often meant the last. The weapons of the Western Front defined the brutality of the Great War. The machine gun, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, made traditional infantry charges suicidal. Artillery, the deadliest force in the war, pounded the trenches day and night, turning the earth into a moonscape. Gas warfare, introduced by Germany in 1915, brought a new kind of terror. Clouds of chlorine and later mustard gas drifted across the battlefield, burning eyes, lungs, and skin. Soldiers scrambled to put on primitive gas masks, often too late to prevent devastating injuries. Technology had advanced far faster than military tactics, creating a deadly imbalance. Generals raised in an era of cavalry charges and bayonet attacks struggled to adapt to a battlefield dominated by industrial weaponry. As a result, battles became tests of endurance, not strategy. Armies launched massive offensives hoping to break the deadlock, but most ended in catastrophic losses for minimal gain. One of the most iconic battles of the Western Front was the Battle of Verdun in 1916. Germany aimed to bleed France dry by attacking a position of immense symbolic importance. The French responded with ferocious determination. For nearly 10 months, Verdun became a furnace of destruction. Millions of shells were fired. Hills were leveled. Forests vanished. Villages were wiped from the map. By the battle's end, over 700,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, yet the front lines barely moved. That same year, the British launched an offensive on the Somme River, intending to relieve pressure on the French. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, British forces suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, the bloodiest day in British military history. While tanks made their debut on the Somme, the battle ultimately became another grinding, costly stalemate. Over 1 million men were killed or wounded, and the front remained largely unchanged. For American audiences watching from afar, the scale of the Western Front was almost unimaginable. U.S. newspapers published photographs of devastated landscapes and casualty lists that stretched for miles. Many Americans questioned how European leaders could allow such destruction. President Woodrow Wilson maintained strict neutrality, arguing that America must remain impartial in thought as well as action. But as reports from Europe became increasingly grim, public opinion slowly began to shift. Americans started to realize that the Great War was not a distant European conflict. It was a global tragedy with consequences that could eventually reach the United States. The Western Front was more than a battlefield. It was a symbol of the terrifying new world created by industrialization, a world where human courage met mechanical slaughter. Soldiers lived for months in trenches dug barely a few feet from the enemy, listening to the shells pounding day and night, wondering if they would survive another dawn. Yet even in this hellish environment, acts of humanity still occurred. Soldiers exchanged food, cigarettes, and small gifts during brief ceasefires. Letters from home offered moments of hope. And Christmas of 1914 saw spontaneous truces along the front. Enemies laying down weapons, singing carols, and sharing a moment of peace before the killing resumed. By the end of 1915, one thing was clear: the Western Front would not be broken easily. It had become a symbol of the Great War's futility, a reminder that modern warfare required new strategies, new technologies, and a new understanding of conflict. The soldiers trapped in its mud and trenches carried the weight of nations on their shoulders, fighting not for grand victories, but for inches of ground. The Western Front was the heart of World War I, a place where empires struggled, armies suffered, and humanity confronted its darkest capabilities. In the next episode, we turn our attention eastward, where the vast landscapes of Russia, the Balkans, and the Middle East reshaped the war into a truly global conflict. While the Western Front descended into a brutal stalemate of trenches and attrition, the war unfolded very differently in the vast territories of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. World War I was more than a European conflict. It was a global war, drawing nations, colonies, and entire populations into a struggle that would redefine the shape of the modern world. This is the story of the conflict beyond the trenches, where empires rose and crumbled, where fronts stretched for hundreds of miles, and where millions fought far from the muddy fields of France and Belgium. As Germany battled Britain and France in the West, it confronted a massive opponent in the East, the Russian Empire. Unlike the static trench networks of the Western Front, the Eastern Front was defined by mobility. Its sheer size, spanning from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains, made rapid movement and sweeping offensives possible. Armies marched across enormous distances, often through thick forests, frozen plains, and rugged terrain. But this mobility came at a cost. Supply lines were long and difficult to maintain, and soldiers faced brutal weather conditions that turned battlefields into frozen wastelands in winter and muddy quagmires in spring. In the early months of the war, Russia mobilized surprisingly fast, launching an invasion into East Prussia. What followed were two of the most defining battles of the Eastern Front, Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. Here, German generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff achieved stunning victories. Using intercepted Russian communications, German forces encircled and destroyed large portions of the Russian army. Tens of thousands were killed or captured. The defeats were catastrophic for Russia and exposed deep flaws in its military leadership, logistics, and communication. Despite these early losses, the Russian Empire remained a formidable force due to its sheer size and manpower. Russian soldiers fought bravely in Galicia and the Carpathians, often facing brutal winter conditions with inadequate supplies. Many lacked proper boots, warm clothing, and ammunition. Disease and famine ravaged the army. Yet Russia continued to throw millions of men into the fight, forcing Austria-Hungary to divert significant resources eastward. The Austrian Empire, already weakened internally, struggled under the pressure. The Eastern Front was not just a military struggle. It became a political and social turning point for Russia. The war placed immense strain on the Russian economy. Food shortages grew severe. Factories couldn't keep up with the demands of total war. Casualties mounted into the millions. Morale collapsed. These conditions fueled the anger of the Russian people and contributed directly to the Russian Revolution of 1917, which would soon remove the Tsar from power and pull Russia out of the war entirely. While the Eastern Front raged, another empire joined the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire. Its entry expanded the war into the Middle East, the Caucasus, and the Dardanelles. The Ottoman decision to side with Germany had global consequences, particularly for the British Empire and its colonies. One of the most dramatic campaigns of the entire war unfolded on the Gallipoli Peninsula in 1915. The Allies, primarily Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand, launched an ambitious operation to seize control of the Dardanelles Strait, open a supply route to Russia, and knock the Ottomans out of the war. However, the campaign quickly turned into a nightmare. Ottoman defenders, led by the future Turkish leader Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, held the high ground and repelled the Allied landings with fierce resistance. Thousands died in trench fights, heat, disease, and relentless counterattacks. After months of heavy losses and little progress, the Allies withdrew. Gallipoli became a defining moment for Ottoman resilience and a national legacy for Anzac forces. Australian and New Zealand soldiers whose courage and sacrifices still shape national identity today. Far to the south, the war reached the deserts and cities of the Middle East. In Mesopotamia, British and Indian forces clashed with Ottoman troops in harsh conditions marked by extreme heat and supply shortages. The campaign saw early failures, including the disastrous siege at Kut, but ultimately the British captured Baghdad in 1917, reshaping the political landscape of the region. In the Arabian Peninsula, Arab nationalists, supported by Britain, launched a revolt against Ottoman rule. Led by figures like T. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, the Arab revolt became one of the most legendary chapters of the war, blending guerrilla warfare, political ambition, and a struggle for independence still remembered across the Middle East. Meanwhile, in Africa, European colonial powers brought the war to territories far from home. French, British, Belgian, and German forces battled across East, West, and Central Africa. Soldiers from African colonies were recruited in vast numbers, serving on multiple fronts. The African campaigns were physically punishing, often fought in dense jungles, savannas, and disease-ridden environments. Yet these African troops played crucial roles in the war effort, an aspect of World War I often overlooked in Western narratives. In Asia and the Pacific, Japan, aligned with the Allies, seized German colonies in the region, including territories in China and island groups across the Pacific. The war allowed Japan to expand its influence, setting the stage for the nation's growing power in the decades that followed. For the United States, observing from across the ocean, the global nature of the conflict became increasingly clear. Americans saw how the war disrupted shipping routes, threatened international trade, and destabilized regions of strategic interest. Reports of battles in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia filled American newspapers, reminding U.S. citizens that World War I was not confined to Europe's borders. The conflict touched every corner of the globe, shaping foreign policies and influencing opinions within the United States. By 1916, the war had become a worldwide struggle of empires, ideologies, and national aspirations. Millions were fighting on fronts that stretched across continents. The Eastern Front remained fluid but devastating. The Middle East saw dramatic victories and crushing defeats. Africa and Asia became battlegrounds for colonial ambitions. And everywhere, civilians suffered under the weight of a conflict that seemed to have no end. The global fronts demonstrated a stark truth. World War I was not a local dispute gone too far. It was the result of decades of political tension, imperial ambition, and international entanglement. As the war expanded in scope, so did its capacity for destruction. But the true turning point, the moment that would alter the direction of the war, was still to come. A turning point that would involve some of the bloodiest battles in human history and the eventual entry of a new power capable of shifting the balance, the United States. In the next episode, we witness the events that transformed the Great War and set humanity on a new trajectory. Verdun, the Somme, the Zimmermann telegram, and the moment America stepped onto the world stage. By the third year of World War I, the optimism that had once fueled young men marching into battle had turned into disillusionment and despair. The war had become a brutal industrial machine, grinding up armies in battles that seemed to offer no end, and 1916 would bring two of the most defining and devastating turning points in the conflict: Verdun and the Somme. These battles would scar Europe's landscape and psyche forever, while across the Atlantic, events were quietly unfolding that would eventually pull the United States into the heart of the war, reshaping global history. In February 1916, Germany launched a massive offensive against the French fortress city of Verdun, choosing the location not for strategic advantage, but for its deep emotional significance to France. The German strategy was horrifying: bleed France dry by attacking a symbol they would defend to the last man. Verdun quickly descended into unimaginable horror. German artillery unleashed a bombardment the world had never seen, firing over 1 million shells in a single day. Forests vaporized, hills flattened, entire villages disappeared so completely that they would never be rebuilt. French soldiers, known as poilus, described a world of constant explosions, choking smoke, and ground soaked with mud, blood, and splintered bone. Often supplies reached the front only by a single road, the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Road, where vehicles moved endlessly without stopping, carrying ammunition in and broken bodies out. General Philippe Pétain rallied French defenders with the immortal words, "They shall not pass." And after 10 months of slaughter, the French held Verdun. Nearly 800,000 men were killed, wounded, or lost, and the front lines barely shifted, but Verdun had become the ultimate symbol of French endurance. As France fought for survival at Verdun, Britain prepared a massive offensive to relieve pressure on its ally, launching the Battle of the Somme on July 1st, 1916, what would become the bloodiest day in British military history. At 7:30 a.m., thousands of British troops climbed out of their trenches and marched toward German lines, believing the preceding artillery bombardment had destroyed enemy defenses. It had not. German bunkers remained intact. Machine guns opened fire as British soldiers advanced in straight lines across no man's land. In a matter of hours, Britain suffered more than 57,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead. The Somme raged for months, turning fields into oceans of mud where entire units vanished. It was here that tanks appeared for the first time. Crude, slow, unreliable machines, but a glimpse of warfare's future. By the time the Somme finally ended, over 1 million men from both sides had become casualties. It was a nightmare, but the battle forced Germany to redirect forces from Verdun and prove that the war had evolved into a new kind of industrialized combat. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Russian Empire struggled under the enormous strain of the war. Russian soldiers lacked boots, ammunition, and food, and while the Brusilov offensive of 1916 delivered one of the war's most successful breakthroughs, the victories hit a collapsing reality. Russia was starving, the government was unstable, and revolution loomed. Across the ocean, the United States watched closely as global instability threatened the balance of power. In 1917, Germany made a fateful decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, desperate to break Britain's naval blockade. German U-boats would now attack any ship, military or civilian, near British waters, and this included American vessels. When American lives were lost to submarine attacks, such as the sinking of the Lusitania, U.S. public opinion shifted sharply. Newspapers demanded action, and American families suddenly felt the European war touching their own shores. Then came a moment that transformed suspicion into outrage: the Zimmermann telegram. In January 1917, British intelligence intercepted a secret German message proposing an alliance with Mexico. If Mexico helped Germany by attacking the United States, Germany promised to support Mexico in reclaiming lost American territories: Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When a message was released to the American public, it exploded across newspapers nationwide. Shock turned to anger. Many who had supported neutrality now saw Germany as a direct threat to American sovereignty. President Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned on keeping America out of the war, realized neutrality was no longer possible. On April 2, 1917, he addressed Congress, declaring that the world must be made safe for democracy. 4 days later, the United States officially entered World War I. By the close of 1917, the world was at a crossroads. Europe was drained. Russia teetered on the brink of collapse. Germany gambled everything on its submarine strategy. Britain and France were desperate for relief. And the United States, once determined to stay out of Europe's conflicts, was mobilizing to join the fight. Verdun, the Somme, unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, and America's entry into the war were the turning points that shifted the direction of history. The stalemate was ending. A new, final, and decisive phase of the Great War was about to begin. By 1917, World War I had reached a breaking point, and the world stood on the edge of seismic transformation as the conflict entered its final, decisive phase. Europe was battered beyond recognition. Cities scarred, economies ruined, and entire societies fraying under the unimaginable weight of war. With the Russian Empire collapsing into revolution and ultimately withdrawing from the conflict after the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany gained the opportunity it had long desired: the chance to shift its massive armies from the Eastern Front to the West for one last, all-or-nothing offensive. Meanwhile, the entry of the United States into the war marked a turning point that would reshape both the battlefield and global politics. American factories roared to life, producing weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies at a scale Europe could no longer sustain. Millions of U.S. soldiers, young, determined, and supported by the full strength of America's industrial power, were now en route to Europe. As the American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing trained and organized in France, Germany knew that time was running out. In early 1918, before large numbers of American troops could reach the front lines, Germany launched the massive Spring Offensive, also known as the Ludendorff Offensive, one of the most ambitious military gambles in modern history. Using stormtrooper infiltration tactics, small, fast-moving units broke through Allied lines with unprecedented speed, pushing the front westward farther than it had moved since 1914. Towns fell, trench systems collapsed under sudden assaults, and for a moment, it seemed as though Germany might actually win the war. The German army came within 50 miles of Paris, and the French capital braced for a potential evacuation. But the offensive carried the seeds of its own destruction. German troops advanced so quickly that supply lines couldn't keep up. Exhausted, hungry, and undersupplied, the attacking forces began to lose momentum. Then, at the critical moment, fresh American troops entered the battlefield in significant numbers. Their arrival brought a level of energy and morale the exhausted Allies desperately needed. The first major test came at the Battle of Cantigny, where U.S. forces successfully captured and held German positions, proving that American troops could fight and win on European soil. The impact of American involvement became undeniable during the Battle of Belleau Wood, one of the most legendary engagements in U.S. Marine Corps history. Facing seasoned German units, American Marines fought with relentless determination in dense forest, earning the nickname Teufelhunden, or Devil Dogs, from their opponents. The cost was high, but the message was unmistakable. The United States had arrived, and it would not be denied. With Germany's spring offensives faltering, the Allies launched a coordinated counterattack known as the 100 Days Offensive. For the first time in years, the Western Front moved steadily eastward. Tanks, aircraft, mechanized artillery, and overwhelming numbers, many supplied or manned by the United States, pushed German forces back past territory they had captured in earlier years. German morale crumbled as food shortages worsened, and the civilian population back home suffered under Allied blockades. By the fall of 1918, it was clear that Germany could no longer continue the fight. Its allies, Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, began to fall one by one. Mutinies erupted in the German Navy, and revolution spread across German cities. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, fled into exile as political chaos consumed the collapsing empire. On November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. Armistice Day marked the end of the Great War, an end brought about by the combined endurance of the Allies and the decisive infusion of American manpower and industrial might. Europe emerged shattered, with entire generations lost and empires dissolved. For the United States, however, World War I marked the rise of a new role, not merely a distant observer of global conflicts, but a central force whose decisions and power could shape the direction of the world. The war had changed everything: borders, governments, societies, and the very concept of warfare itself. Yet even in victory, darker storms gathered. The peace that followed would be anything but stable, and the world was about to enter a new era shaped by resentment, revolution, and unresolved tensions. What came next would lead humanity down a road toward an even more devastating conflict, one that would make the Great War seem like only the beginning. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11th, 1918, the world emerged into an uneasy quiet that felt almost unnatural after 4 years of relentless death and destruction. Cities lay in ruins, nations were bankrupt, entire regions were depopulated, and millions of families grieved sons, fathers, and brothers who would never return. Yet as the smoke cleared, it became painfully clear that the end of fighting did not mean the end of the war's consequences. Instead, humanity stepped into a complicated and volatile aftermath that would shape the rest of the 20th century. Across Europe, empires that had dominated global politics for centuries collapsed in rapid succession. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a sprawling patchwork of cultures stretching across Central and Eastern Europe, disintegrated overnight. Its people, Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Croats, Slovenes, Austrians, scrambled to form new national identities from the fragments of what had been a multi-ethnic state. The Ottoman Empire, weakened by years of war and internal division, finally fell apart, leaving behind a vacuum in the Middle East that would sow conflict for generations. The Russian Empire had already crumbled in revolution, plunging into a brutal civil war that would give birth to the Soviet Union, an entirely new kind of political power. Amid this upheaval, the victorious Allies faced the monumental task of designing a peace that could prevent another catastrophic conflict. In January 1919, world leaders gathered at the Paris Peace Conference, where the dominant voices belonged to the so-called Big Four: U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. For the United States, this was a defining moment. America had entered the war late but decisively, and the world now looked to the U.S. as a stabilizing force and a symbol of democratic hope. President Wilson arrived in Europe to widespread admiration, carrying his blueprint for a peaceful future. The 14 Points, a set of principles aimed at promoting self-determination, open diplomacy, free trade, and the creation of a new international organization that would mediate disputes and prevent future wars, the League of Nations. But the optimism Wilson brought was soon tested by the harsh reality of European anger and trauma. France, having endured unimaginable suffering on its own soil, demanded severe punishment for Germany. Clemenceau, known as the Tiger, pushed for reparations so steep they would cripple Germany for generations, insisting that the nation responsible for starting the war must pay for the devastation it caused. Britain, too, sought reparations, but also hoped to maintain its naval supremacy and empire. Italy demanded territorial gains it claimed were promised during the war. Wilson, desperate to preserve his vision of a just and lasting peace, found himself navigating a political storm, one that pitted idealism against vengeance. The resulting Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, became one of the most controversial documents in modern history. Germany, not invited to the negotiations, was forced to accept full responsibility for the war under Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. The treaty stripped Germany of its colonies, reduced its military to a fraction of its former size, forbade it from possessing tanks, aircraft, and submarines, and imposed crushing financial reparations that strained its economy to breaking point. The German people felt humiliated, betrayed, and resentful. Many saw the treaty not as peace, but as punishment, a sentiment that extremist movements would later exploit with catastrophic consequences. Meanwhile, new nations emerged across Europe as borders were redrawn. Poland regained independence. Yugoslavia was created. Czechoslovakia took shape, and the Middle East was carved into British and French mandates with little regard for ethnic or religious divisions, planting seeds of conflict still felt today. President Wilson returned home, believing he had secured the foundation for a peaceful world order through the creation of the League of Nations. Yet in a dramatic twist, the United States Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Many Americans feared entangling alliances and questioned why U.S. soldiers should ever again be drawn into a European war. Despite Wilson's passionate nationwide campaign, the United States never joined the League of Nations, crippling the organization before it even began. For Americans, the post-war years brought both hope and turbulence. The nation emerged from World War I as a global economic powerhouse, entering the Roaring '20s, a decade of booming industry, cultural flourishing, and technological innovation. But beneath the prosperity lay tensions, racial conflicts, returning veterans struggling to reintegrate, economic inequality, and growing political divides that would soon collide with global instability. The world hoped that the Great War had been the war to end all wars. Yet the Treaty of Versailles left behind resentment, instability, and unresolved rivalries. The collapse of old empires created power vacuums. Harsh terms imposed on Germany fueled bitterness and paved the way for extremist ideologies. The failure of the League of Nations to enforce peace showed that even the most idealistic visions require unity and commitment to succeed. The war had ended, but its shadows stretched far into the future. In attempting to craft a lasting peace, the world had instead set the stage for an even more devastating conflict. World War I reshaped borders, societies, and the global balance of power, but its aftermath revealed a deeper truth. Peace is fragile when built on anger, fear, and unresolved grievances. And soon, just 2 decades later, humanity would face the consequences of these unresolved wounds as the world marched toward World War II. While World War I raged across Europe and reshaped the map of continents, its impact on the United States was equally profound, though less immediately visible on the battlefield. America's entry into the war in 1917 catalyzed a transformation that would touch every corner of society, from factories and farms to cities and rural towns, and set the stage for the nation's emergence as a global power. On the home front, the federal government mobilized an unprecedented economic and social effort to support the war. The War Industries Board coordinated the production of weapons, ammunition, and supplies, effectively converting civilian industry into a wartime engine capable of sustaining millions of soldiers overseas. Railroads, steel plants, shipyards, and munitions factories operated at full capacity, often running 24/7, employing women, African Americans, and immigrants in roles previously denied to them, thereby reshaping the American workforce. This shift not only accelerated women's entry into industrial labor, laying the groundwork for future social change and suffrage, but also fueled the Great Migration as hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved from the rural South to northern cities in search of factory jobs and better opportunities, forever altering the demographics, culture, and politics of cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York. The government's influence extended into daily life through organizations such as the Committee on Public Information, which controlled wartime propaganda, shaped public opinion, and encouraged citizens to buy Liberty bonds to fund the war effort. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 reflected a darker side of this mobilization, limiting free speech and criminalizing dissent as the government sought to suppress anti-war voices and enforce unity, revealing the tension between democratic ideals and wartime necessity. Economically, the war propelled the United States into a position of unparalleled global influence. American banks and industries became critical suppliers to the Allies even before troops arrived, and by 1918, the U.S. had established itself as the world's creditor nation, signaling a dramatic shift from isolation to international engagement. Militarily, the experiences of the American expeditionary forces in Europe, from Cantigny to Belleau Wood and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, demonstrated that the United States could project power abroad, and the professionalization and modernization of the U.S. Army and Navy set the stage for the nation's future global interventions. Socially and culturally, the war accelerated changes in technology, communication, and urban life. The introduction of new media, including film and radio, allowed Americans to follow the war in near real time, creating a sense of connection to a distant conflict and forging a national consciousness around global events. Meanwhile, returning soldiers faced challenges reintegrating into civilian life, sparking discussions about veterans' benefits, healthcare, and employment, issues that would influence domestic policy for decades. Politically, the war cemented the United States' role as a key player in international diplomacy. President Wilson's vision of a League of Nations may have been rejected domestically, but America's moral and economic influence on the post-war settlement was undeniable, signaling the country's emergence from relative isolation to a position of global responsibility. Culturally, the war inspired new forms of artistic expression and literature, as writers, poets, and artists grappled with the trauma of modern industrial warfare, creating a uniquely American perspective on global conflict that reflected both heroism and disillusionment. The combination of industrial mobilization, social change, military engagement, and diplomatic influence meant that World War I was not just a European war affecting Europe. It was a crucible in which the United States forged its identity as a modern nation-state and global power. By 1919, as soldiers returned home and the nation celebrated victory abroad, Americans were confronted with a transformed society, one more urban, more industrialized, more diverse, and more attuned to the realities of a connected world. The war had revealed the power and potential of the United States on the world stage, while also exposing deep social, political, and economic challenges that would shape the country throughout the 20th century. In short, World War I didn't just reshape the globe. It reshaped America itself, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond the battlefields of Europe and into the heart of the nation's political, economic, and cultural life. World War I ended over a century ago, yet its impact continues to resonate, shaping nations, societies, and global consciousness in ways that are still profoundly felt today. The Great War, often described as the first modern industrial conflict, left behind a legacy of technological, political, and social transformation that reverberated across the globe, fundamentally altering the course of history. Militarily, it demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of industrialized warfare, the destructive power of artillery, machine guns, tanks, and chemical weapons, and the immense human cost of trench and total war, forcing military strategists in the United States and other nations to rethink doctrine, technology, and strategy for generations to come. Politically, the collapse of empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, reconfigured borders and birthed new nations, while highlighting the fragility of peace imposed without justice and national self-determination, lessons that American policymakers studied carefully as they navigated the interwar period. Socially and culturally, the war accelerated shifts that were already underway in American society. Women assumed unprecedented roles in industry and public life, African Americans migrated to northern cities in the Great Migration, and veterans returned home with new perspectives on citizenship, democracy, and civil rights, all of which influenced domestic policies and cultural movements for decades. The war also transformed collective memory and public commemoration, as monuments, memorials, and ceremonies, like Armistice Day, later Veterans Day, were established to honor the dead and teach future generations about sacrifice, patriotism, and the consequences of global conflict, embedding World War I into the national consciousness of the United States and Europe alike. Economically, the war marked America's emergence as a global financial and industrial powerhouse, demonstrating the strategic importance of industrial capacity, logistics, and mobilization, lessons that informed both the preparation for and execution of World War II. In education, literature, and art, the war's trauma inspired generations of writers, artists, and filmmakers who grappled with the paradox of human courage amid senseless slaughter, giving rise to works that remain central to our understanding of modern warfare and its psychological impact. Diplomatically, the war offered profound lessons in the dangers of nationalism, unresolved grievances, and punitive peace settlements, as the Treaty of Versailles and the failure of the League of Nations highlighted the necessity of fair negotiation, international cooperation, and multilateral institutions, a principle that would influence U.S. foreign policy throughout the 20th century and beyond. On a global scale, World War I revealed the interconnectedness of nations, economies, and societies, showing that conflicts confined to one region can quickly become global crises, a truth that shaped American strategy, alliances, and engagement in international affairs. For the United States in particular, the war marked the beginning of a new era. The nation had transitioned from relative isolation to a central role in world affairs, balancing moral responsibility, economic interests, and military power in shaping the emerging international order. The legacy of World War I is thus both cautionary and instructive. It stands as a testament to human resilience, innovation, and sacrifice, while also serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of miscalculation, unchecked aggression, and the failure to address political and social grievances. From the muddy trenches of the Western Front to the deserts of the Middle East, from the factories of American cities to the halls of international diplomacy, the lessons of World War I continue to inform how nations wage war, build peace, and remember those who gave everything for a world forever changed. Today, as we reflect on the Great War, we see that its memory is not simply history. It is a mirror showing the cost of conflict, the fragility of peace, and the enduring human capacity to learn, rebuild, and strive for a more stable and just world, reminding Americans and all viewers that the echoes of 1914 to 1918 still shape the global stage and our collective understanding of courage, sacrifice, and responsibility. As the guns fell silent across Europe in November 1918, the world faced the colossal task of confronting the aftermath of a conflict unlike any other, a war that had stretched across continents, destroyed empires, and reshaped human society in unprecedented ways. The physical devastation was staggering. Cities and towns lay in ruins, infrastructure was shattered, and millions of soldiers and civilians were dead, wounded, or displaced, leaving entire societies to grapple with grief, poverty, and political instability. In Europe, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires created a vacuum that sparked nationalist movements and the creation of new states. While Germany faced severe economic hardship and social unrest under the punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles, fostering deep resentment that would echo through history. Russia, meanwhile, was consumed by revolution, civil war, and famine, giving rise to the Soviet Union, a new ideological power that would alter the global balance and capture the attention of policymakers in Washington, London, and Paris. For the United States, the war represented a dramatic turning point. The nation had transitioned from relative isolation to a global player with economic, political, and military influence, having mobilized industries, modernized its armed forces, and demonstrated the capacity to project power overseas. The home front had been transformed as well. Women assumed unprecedented roles in factories, transportation, and public service, fueling the suffrage movement and broader social reforms. African Americans participated in the Great Migration, reshaping urban demographics and contributing to new cultural, political, and economic dynamics. And returning veterans faced the challenge of reintegration, influencing policy debates around healthcare, pensions, and social welfare. Diplomatically, World War I offered lessons in both opportunity and caution. President Woodrow Wilson's vision for the League of Nations showcased America's potential to lead in global peace, yet the Senate's refusal to ratify the Treaty of Versailles demonstrated the complexities of balancing domestic politics with international responsibility. Globally, the war had demonstrated the lethal potential of industrialized conflict. Artillery, machine guns, tanks, chemical warfare, and aerial combat forever changed military strategy, compelling nations to rethink how wars would be fought in the 20th century. Socially and culturally, the Great War left a profound imprint. Literature, film, and art grappled with the realities of heroism, trauma, and the human cost of industrialized slaughter. Memorials, monuments, and ceremonies institutionalized remembrance, and education systems began incorporating the war as a lens through which future generations could understand leadership, sacrifice, and global interconnectedness. Economically, the United States emerged as a creditor nation and industrial powerhouse, signaling a shift in global power and setting the stage for American influence throughout the 20th century. The lessons of World War I were clear. Unresolved political grievances, economic instability, and national humiliation could plant the seeds of future conflict, while technological innovation, strategic industrial mobilization, and social reforms could propel nations forward. For American audiences, these lessons remain highly relevant, offering insight into both the responsibilities of global leadership and the costs of war. As we reflect on this monumental period, the legacy of World War I is not just a historical memory. It is a living narrative showing how human resilience, innovation, and sacrifice can shape the modern world while reminding us of the consequences of failure, miscalculation, and unaddressed tension. Economically, the United States emerged as a creditor nation and industrial powerhouse, signaling a shift in global power and setting the stage for American influence throughout the 20th century. The lessons of World War I were clear. Unresolved political grievances, economic instability, and national humiliation could plant the seeds of future conflict, while technological innovation, strategic industrial mobilization, and social reforms could propel nations forward. For American audiences, these lessons remain highly relevant, offering insight into both the responsibilities of global leadership and the costs of war. As we reflect on this monumental period, the legacy of World War I is not just a historical memory. It is a living narrative showing how human resilience, innovation, and sacrifice can shape the modern world while reminding us of the consequences of failure, miscalculation, and unaddressed tension. World War I was not only a conflict of nations and armies, but also a crucible of technological innovation, a war in which industry, science, and human ingenuity collided to reshape the very nature of combat in the modern world, leaving lessons that would reverberate across decades. The mechanization of warfare, from machine guns to tanks, artillery, and chemical weapons, demonstrated the deadly efficiency of industrialized armies, forcing military strategists to rethink tactics, logistics, and strategy on an unprecedented scale. The introduction of tanks, first seen on the Somme in 1916, transformed battlefields, offering mobility and firepower that could traverse no man's land, crush barbed wire, and break through entrenched defenses, signaling the end of traditional infantry-only warfare. Airplanes, initially used for reconnaissance, quickly evolved into fighter jets and bombers, giving rise to aerial combat and strategic bombing, which brought the war to cities and factories far behind enemy lines and foreshadowed the global air campaigns of later conflicts. Chemical weapons, from chlorine to mustard gas, introduced a new form of horror, creating a need for gas masks, protective clothing, and medical innovations, while demonstrating the moral and ethical dilemmas of industrialized killing. Submarines, particularly German U-boats, revolutionized naval warfare, threatening commercial shipping and supply lines across the Atlantic, ultimately influencing U.S. engagement in the war and reshaping international maritime strategy. Communications technology also advanced rapidly, with telegraphs, radio, and encrypted codes playing critical roles in coordinating massive offensives, intercepting enemy plans, and integrating multinational forces, highlighting the growing importance of information warfare. Medical science and battlefield medicine saw leaps forward, with advances in surgical techniques, trauma care, and the treatment of infectious diseases saving countless lives and establishing standards that would influence both military and civilian healthcare for generations. These technological innovations were not confined to Europe. They had global consequences, reshaping strategies in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, where colonial and regional forces adopted new weapons, tactics, and training, fundamentally altering the way wars were fought worldwide. For the United States, observing and participating in this technological revolution highlighted both the nation's industrial capacity and its potential to influence global conflicts with innovation, production, and strategy, foreshadowing America's role as a technological and military powerhouse in the 20th century. Beyond the battlefield, these innovations spurred economic growth, industrial mobilization, and scientific research, intertwining war and modernity in ways that transformed societies at home and abroad. The Great War demonstrated that victory was no longer achieved solely through numbers or valor. It depended equally on industry, science, logistics, and technological adaptation. For U.S. viewers and history enthusiasts, understanding this dimension of World War I illuminates the profound ways in which conflict accelerates innovation and reshapes society, proving that the consequences of war extend far beyond the battlefield, influencing diplomacy, culture, economy, and the trajectory of nations. The innovations of World War I were both a warning and a promise. They revealed the destructive potential of industrialized warfare, while also offering humanity new tools, knowledge, and strategies to navigate the modern age, leaving a legacy that continues to inform military, scientific, and political thought today. World War I was not only a war of technology and strategy, but also a war of unimaginable human suffering, a global conflict in which the lives of millions of soldiers and civilians were forever altered by violence, deprivation, and trauma, leaving scars that would echo across generations. On the front lines, soldiers endured the horrors of trench warfare, living in mud-filled, rat-infested trenches under constant threat from artillery, machine guns, and poison gas, where days blurred into nights of fear, exhaustion, and unimaginable loss. The psychological toll was staggering. Shell shock, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected countless men, producing symptoms of anxiety, tremors, and emotional paralysis, while countless others struggled silently with memories of fallen comrades and the relentless brutality of the battlefield. Casualties were staggering, with millions killed, wounded, or permanently maimed, leaving families and communities to grapple with the devastating impact on both personal and national levels. Beyond the front, civilians faced blockades, famine, occupation, and disease, as the war disrupted agriculture, trade, and infrastructure, producing shortages of food, medicine, and basic necessities, particularly in Germany, France, Belgium, and Eastern Europe. Women, children, and the elderly bore the brunt of these hardships, while simultaneously contributing to the war effort by working in factories, nursing the wounded, and maintaining communities under immense strain. The influenza pandemic of 1918 compounded the suffering, killing millions worldwide and striking down young adults who had survived the war's battlefields, intertwining the devastation of disease with that of armed conflict. In the United States, while the mainland avoided the physical destruction experienced in Europe, American soldiers faced the horrors of battle abroad, and returning veterans struggled with reintegration, trauma, and societal change, influencing public attitudes toward mental health, healthcare, and national responsibility for those who served. Memorials, cemeteries, and commemorative practices were established to honor the dead, reflecting both grief and the desire to find meaning in immense loss, while literature and personal diaries provided intimate insight into the emotional and psychological realities of war, offering future generations a window into courage, fear, and resilience. World War I exposed the profound cost of modern industrialized warfare, not only in lives but in communities, economies, and social structures, highlighting the interconnectedness of human experience in times of global conflict. For U.S. audiences and history enthusiasts, understanding the human dimension of World War I is crucial as it illustrates the sacrifices that underpin victory, the resilience of those who endured unimaginable hardship, and the importance of remembering both the triumphs and tragedies of history. The war reshaped notions of heroism, duty, and citizenship, showing that victory comes at a profound cost and that the human spirit, though tested, remains capable of endurance, adaptation, and reflection, leaving lessons about empathy, responsibility, and the value of peace that continue to resonate today. World War I reshaped not only nations and societies, but also the global economy, leaving behind a landscape of debt, reconstruction, and unprecedented opportunity, with profound consequences for both Europe and the United States. European nations, having spent 4 years mobilizing millions of soldiers and pouring enormous resources into the war effort, emerged financially exhausted, facing massive debts, inflation, and a shattered industrial base, while reconstruction demanded enormous investment in infrastructure, housing, and social services for war-torn populations. Germany, burdened by reparations imposed under the Treaty of Versailles, struggled to stabilize its economy, experiencing hyperinflation and widespread unemployment that fueled political instability and public resentment, illustrating the dangerous intersection of economics and social unrest. In contrast, the United States, having joined the war late but decisively, emerged as a creditor nation and a global economic powerhouse, supplying not only military equipment, but also food, raw materials, and financial loans to the Allies, a position that shifted the balance of global economic power across the Atlantic. American industry thrived during and after the war, as factories adapted to wartime production and then transitioned to consumer goods, fostering technological innovation, mass production techniques, and urban growth, particularly in cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York. The war accelerated the modernization of transportation, communication, and energy sectors, while also reshaping labor markets. Women and minorities had joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, laying the foundation for social and economic transformations in the 1920s and beyond. Domestically, the post-war period brought both prosperity and challenges, as returning veterans sought employment, inflation affected cost of living, and businesses adjusted from wartime economies to peacetime demand. Globally, the war's economic consequences highlighted the interconnectedness of nations. European reconstruction relied heavily on American loans and investment, while trade and diplomacy became tools to stabilize fragile economies and prevent further conflict. The experience of World War I also informed U.S. policy, emphasizing the importance of industrial capacity, fiscal responsibility, and international economic engagement, lessons that would guide America through future crises, including the Great Depression and World War II. For modern viewers, understanding these economic dynamics illuminates how war extends far beyond the battlefield, influencing the distribution of power, the rise of new industries, and the social fabric of nations, while demonstrating the critical role the United States played in shaping the post-war global economy. The story of World War I's economic consequences is not merely about debt and reconstruction. It is about the emergence of modern financial systems, industrial might, and the ways in which human innovation, resilience, and enterprise respond to catastrophe, creating opportunities even amidst destruction. As the dust settled from 4 years of unprecedented global conflict, the legacy of World War I extended far beyond the trenches, battlefields, and shattered cities of Europe, leaving a profound imprint on politics, society, culture, and the very understanding of modern warfare, while shaping the trajectory of nations for generations to come. The war had demonstrated the lethal combination of industrialized technology, global alliances, and total mobilization, forever altering military strategy and international relations, and highlighting the dangers of nationalism, unresolved grievances, and punitive peace settlements. For the United States, World War I marked the emergence of a nation as a central actor on the global stage. Economically, the U.S. became a creditor and industrial powerhouse. Politically, it gained influence in international diplomacy despite initially rejecting the League of Nations. Socially, the war accelerated changes in labor, gender roles, and civil rights that reshaped the domestic landscape. Globally, the collapse of empires, the rise of new nations, and revolutionary movements redefined borders and ideologies, teaching lessons about governance, stability, and the interconnectedness of nations that continue to resonate in the modern world. The human cost. Millions of soldiers and civilians killed, wounded, or displaced, and the psychological toll of shell shock and trauma serve as a stark reminder of the sacrifices required by global conflict, while inspiring art, literature, education, and commemoration to ensure the memories of the fallen endured. The innovations in technology, medicine, logistics, and industry demonstrated that progress can emerge even amidst devastation, but also that unchecked militarization and political miscalculation can produce catastrophic consequences. World War I's enduring legacy is therefore a tapestry of triumph and tragedy, progress and caution, remembrance and warning, emphasizing that the lessons of the past are essential for shaping a more stable, just, and informed world today. For American audiences in particular, understanding this legacy underscores the nation's evolving role in global affairs, the responsibilities of leadership, and the power of resilience and innovation in times of crisis. And for viewers eager to explore the untold stories, hidden heroes, and cinematic histories of the past, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Era, your ultimate destination for immersive documentaries, deep dives into history, and storytelling that brings the past alive, especially for our U.S.-based viewers who want to understand how World War I shaped America, its society, and its role in the modern world. History is not just something we read about. It's something we experience, learn from, and carry forward, and Hidden Era is here to guide you through every epic chapter.